everyone. It's great to be back with you for another engaging discussion. Books and Bridges is a public humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We explore the wisdoms of the world and apply them to modern life. Searching in civil discourse across the liberal arts is our aim. Tonight, we will learn from an unlikely duo, a novelist of keen psychological insight who dissects the motives of the heart, and an ethics philosopher who is often called the father of economics. Jane Austen demonstrates that the medium of fiction can put flesh and bone on moral theory, and Adam Smith shows that underneath the pursuit of wealth lies a vast field of moral deliberation. Drawing out the connective threads between these two towering figures will be Dr. Shannon Chamberlain. Dr. Chamberlain is a tutor, equivalent of professor, at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. She received a BA in early modern history and literature at Harvard University and a PhD in English literature from the University of California, Berkeley. At Berkeley, she was a fellow at the Townsend Center for the Humanities, and at George Mason University, she was an Adam Smith Fellow at the Mercatus Center. She has published essays in The Atlantic, the Journal of Scottish Philosophy, and writes and illustrates children's books. After the presentation, feel free to submit your questions. So Dr. Chamberlain, the floor is all yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm looking forward to this. And thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to the Q&A period as well. Can everybody hear me? I hope. Okay, great. So one of the great pleasures of learning a new language is the lens that you gain into other cultures and their abiding philosophical concerns. So as Nathan just mentioned, I teach at St. John's College, where ancient Greek is mandatory and every faculty member teaches every subject. This is my first time learning or teaching Greek. And as someone whose graduate school field of study was the history and literature of economic ideas, I've been particularly keen on tracking what our translation exercises reveal about the Greek attitude towards money and wealth. What becomes quickly apparent is that ancient philosophy considered economic activity of any kind at best a necessary evil, and at worst, the single most dire corrupter of men and morals that human civilization has ever managed to invent. One of the first aphorisms one learns as a student of ancient Greek is from Menander: "The just man does not possess wealth at any time." My Greek textbook abounds with variations on this sentiment. A recent sample: "The orator led the citizens into injustice by means of riches. It is shameful for a man to have wealth in life, for he will have no wealth in his soul. On the one hand, this path leads to virtue. On the other, this path leads to riches. Being wealthy, I am unhappy." And so on. You begin, I think, to gain an understanding for the world that formed Plato's injunctions against the rulers of society having personal possessions when you study Greek. There's a starkness about the language's idiom for money and wealth and the way that it juxtaposes the accumulation of these things with the accumulation of wisdom and even happiness. And the Christian world seems to inherit this idea from the Greek. While a biblical scholar might point out to me that it's not money itself that Paul names as the root of all evil, but the love of money, it's also fairly clear from the stories of the early Christian martyrs that love of money is often a synonym for possessing any of it. As any student of medieval and Renaissance history could probably tell you, the fabulously wealthy Roman Catholic Church struggled with this slight case of schizophrenia about its own material possessions for much of its history, culminating in the Reformation critiques of greed and banality. Of course, some of the descendants of those same sober black-clad critics, many of whom cited Plato and other ancient philosophers alongside scripture to condemn the holdings of the Roman Church, proved surprisingly adept at making money while purporting to disdain it themselves, as Max Weber would point out in the 20th century. So this 2-minute history of the ethics of money is merely meant to point out that cognitive dissonance about the moral worth of money and the desirability of possessing at least some of it is a long-standing, if somewhat neglected, problem in ethics. Socrates gets around it by living off the largesse of his friends, but that money has to come from somewhere. And his solution to me has always seemed to sidestep some of the more interesting and relevant questions, at least for those of us who aren't so wise that our friends pay us to talk. Those questions are: is there some amount of money that is reasonable to possess, or does even a small amount transform our relationship to our souls in a quest for wisdom? As we move into the Industrial Revolution, when money acquires a less static quality and fortunes can be made and lost instead of merely being passed down from one generation to the next, what is the proper attitude towards the pursuit of money in business or the professions and the material comforts it might provide? How much should we give up of other values, the search for knowledge and wisdom, the joy of art and hobbies, the comforts of family life, to ensure a reasonable material prosperity to enjoy these things? Is it really realistic, as Plato and a number of later thinkers working in his tradition might propose, to isolate the pursuit of wisdom or the pursuit of happiness from the pursuit of material comfort? Are there perhaps even virtues to be discovered and practiced by the person who seeks a certain amount of material success in the world, as opposed to those held by the person who is completely indifferent to money? So today I'd like to propose that some of the most sophisticated and nuanced answers to these questions came from two Industrial Revolution thinkers, one a moral philosopher and one a novelist. And I think it's easier to think of the particular moral philosopher I have in mind, Adam Smith, as an Industrial Revolution thinker, especially if you know his famous economic text, The Wealth of Nations, better than his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Jane Austen maybe seems like a harder sell, perhaps because she confined herself, as she once described it in a letter, to the miniature painting of 3 or 4 families in a country village. What she neglects to say, perhaps protecting her novelist's trade secrets, is that those 3 or 4 families boast some very clever modern young women who, although they can't go out and earn capital themselves, understand that they need to think carefully about what the meaning of money is and what its relationship to their happiness and romantic prospects might be. In fact, the questions of money and happiness touch them even more, particularly because their quest for money occurs in the context of a deeply personal, intimate relationship. In this attempt to sort out what prosperity and the pursuit of wealth through advantageous marriages means for happiness and romantic love, she seems to converse with Smith, who himself conversed with some of the best philosophers and pre-modern economists as he thought about what a moral reckoning with the pursuit of wealth and money might look like. But Smith, of course, writes for men who can earn money through the invention of new products or services or the application of their talents to a profession, and still maintain at least something of a private domestic life that might isolate itself from the pursuit of money. Austen, in choosing the lives of early 19th century British women as her subject, is talking about women who must rely on their wits to gain fortunes by proxy through matrimony. They have no luxury to pursue money-making by day and private lives by night. So the question of money and happiness, if anything, becomes far more complex and entangled for them, and far more interesting for us to consider. Smith still inherits some of what I described earlier as the cognitive dissonance of wanting money while disdaining it, although he moves us a bit closer to a consideration of the problem that at least acknowledges that cognitive dissonance. It's in Austen's work, though, that a fully fleshed out reckoning happens in the rich and detailed moral lives of her heroines. Today, for lack of time, I'll just focus on Sense and Sensibility, her most Smithian novel. But this tendency to think carefully and practically about the role of money in love and happiness, and not to dismiss it as negligible or unimportant, is found in almost all of her characters, from Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice to the 3 sisters with vastly different fortunes in Mansfield Park, to Anne Elliot's financial speculations in Austen's final novel, Persuasion. Austen's heroines are fortune seekers in the best sense of the word, using the assets that they have to make their ways in the world, while trying to determine how their quest for happiness might coincide with their quest for material comfort. First, though, let's consider how Smith is helpful for the consideration of the problems that Austen brings to life. P.J. O'Rourke calls Smith's 1776 text, The Wealth of Nations, the most famous book that nobody ever reads. And while I think there are other plausible contenders for that prize, I see his point. Smith himself considered it his less important book after his 1760 Theory of Moral Sentiments. He kept revising this latter work up to his death in 1790. So personally, I like to think of these two books in the paradigm of George Lucas in the Star Wars movies. At the beginning of his career, Smith wrote an exceptionally fine revolutionary text that reflects on some of the most pressing philosophical issues of his time and of all time, which have much to do with how humans envision shared moral communities, especially in the context of great wealth and prosperity that the Industrial Revolution was bringing about. The popularity of this book, and it was widely read and admired, suggested to him in the intervening 15 years that he ought to provide an account of how his wealth and prosperity came to be. Then when he discovered what he discovered while writing that book caused him to go back and revise what he'd written in the earlier books 6 times because everybody was complaining about that Jar Jar character he introduced and all of the extraneous use of CGI. But in all seriousness, like the Star Wars movies and its prequels, it's hard to understand the reason for the wealth of nations or appreciate it independently without first thinking about the theory of moral sentiments. If you're one of the many people who hasn't read The Wealth of Nations, you shouldn't feel bad. But second, you probably think that you already know a few things about it. And one of those things might be that it introduces the concept of the invisible hand, which is Smith's metaphor for the way the great material wealth tends to trickle down and benefit the poor. And everything I just said there is wrong. The invisible hand appears in the theory of moral sentiments, not as a full-throated endorsement of some kind of mad Gordon Gekko-esque greed is good for the world bit of pseudo-philosophizing, but as the articulation of a real moral problem that Smith sees but isn't quite able to solve for himself, although he realizes that it needs to be addressed. So what's that problem? It's a version of the one that I've already brought up, one that goes back at least to the Republic. In the Republic, Socrates concludes that the only way to ensure a simultaneously prosperous and just society dedicated to the pursuit of wisdom is to effectively create a division of labor between the people who do the thinking and the governing and the ones who do the laboring. For Plato, of course, the primary concern in isolating these two classes of people is ensuring justice. Smith, following Aristotle more closely than Plato, is inclined to frame the goal as happiness and human flourishing. Putting this all together then, Smith's worry is that one essentially has to create two kinds of people, one happy, or as he prefers to put it, tranquil, and the other spinning his or her wheels in the pursuit of wealth so fast that tranquility is impossible, even as all of the labor and striving of that individual creates benefits for all. He doesn't like this solution and sees it as a problem, but perhaps an unsolvable one. So let's look at the passage in the theory of moral sentiments where this dichotomy between happy and prosperity comes up. He delivers it as a parable about someone whom Smith calls the poor man's son, whom heaven in its anger has visited with ambition. This poor man's son, living in his humble father's cottage, develops ambitions beyond his station by admiring the condition of the rich. He imagines himself, instead of walking on foot, to be riding in one of the handsome carriages, that he sees on the road from time to time. His own opinion about himself is that he's a naturally lazy sort of person. So the idea of having a larger number of time-saving conveniences, like a bigger house or a faster, less physically taxing means of transport, appeals to him. But some of these things are useful and some of them are not, as Smith points out. Some of them are what he calls trinkets of frivolous utility. One example he gives is a watch that keeps slightly better time than another watch. Another example, and let's keep this one in mind because it's important for Austen, is a curious little 18th century bauble, a tweezer case. Yes, literally a prettily decorated case in which to store one's tweezers. To some extent, we all participate in this kind of self-delusion. We imagine that we'll be happier and have more time if we upgrade our Fitbit 4s to Fitbit Luxes, which can calculate some algorithm to tell us about our stress levels, little realizing that if we're buying a watch to track our stress levels, we already know what our stress level is. In the case of such minor purchases, we might shrug and say they're a harmless indulgence, although Smith, ever the frugal Scot, reminds us of how much money we lay out for such dubious little toys. For the rich man's son, the situation is much worse, though. Instead of wanting an upgraded tweezer case, he is capable of a much greater and more terrible thing, actually imagining himself to be truly rich. It may be one thing to blow a couple of quid on a new and exciting watch, but it's quite another to dedicate your life to the idea that someday you'll be able to own the carriage equivalent of a Bentley, which you will park on your charming and Downton-esque country estate. And just to remind us, the very reason that the poor man's son originally comes up with this plan is because he thinks about himself as lazy and indolent. He imagines his life will be easier and therefore happier if he can pull this off. As a result of that belief, Smith tells us, quote, he submits in the first year, nay, in the first month of his application, to more fatigue of body and more uneasiness of mind than he could have suffered throughout the whole of his life from the want of them. He studies to distinguish himself in some laborious profession. With the most unrelenting industry, he labors day and night to acquire talents superior to all of his competitors. He endeavors next to bring those talents into public view, and with equal assiduity solicits every opportunity of employment. For this purpose, he makes court to all mankind. He serves those whom he hates and is obsequious to those whom he despises. Through the whole of his life, he pursues the idea of a certain artificial and elegant repose, which he may never arrive at, and for which he sacrifices a real tranquility that is at all times in his power, and which, if in the extremity of old age he should at last attain to it, he will find to be in no respect preferable to that humble security and contentment which he had abandoned for it. It is then, in the last dregs of life, his body wasted with toil and diseases, his mind galled and ruffled by the memory of 1,000 injuries and disappointments which he imagined he has met with from the injustice of his enemies or from the perfidy and ingratitude of his friends, that he begins at last to find that wealth and greatness are mere trinkets of frivolous utility, no more adapted for procuring ease of body or tranquility of mind than the tweezer cases of the lover of toys. And like them too, more troublesome to the person who carries them about with him than all the advantages they can afford him are commodious. So this all sounds pretty bad. Because the poor man's son thinks he is lazy and wants to procure more means of being lazy, he toils hard for all of his life, and only in the final year or two realizes that a terrible trick has been played on him. He was happier, or as Smith puts it, more tranquil, in his little cottage. Don't be that guy, Smith suggests. Fair enough, moral problem solved. But then the passage takes an odd turn. Smith says that it's only in those moments of sickness and decline, of low spirits and spleen, that this bit of splenetic philosophy makes sense to us. Quote, in this miserable aspect does greatness appear to every man when reduced either by spleen or disease to observe with attention his own situation and to consider what it is that is really wanting to his happiness. Power and riches appear then to be what they are, enormous and operose machines contrived to provide a few trifling conveniences to the body, consisting of springs the most nice and delicate, which must be kept in order with the most anxious attention, and which in spite of all our care are ready every moment to burst into pieces and to crush their ruins their unfortunate possessor. However, and this is important, it's only in moments of bad spirits or health that we can see the reality of things. When we're in better spirits and health, quote, our imagination in times of ease and prosperity expands itself to everything around us. We are then again charmed with the beauty of that accommodation which reigns in the palaces and economy of the great, and admire how everything is adapted to promote their ease, to prevent their wants, to gratify their wishes, and to amuse and entertain their most frivolous desires. I think it's fair to say that most of us prefer to be in good health, and also fair to say that Smith's description of this sounds about right. I do feel more imaginative and alive and open to the possibilities of the world when I'm not lying in bed with the flu. The troubling part is that he's probably also right that when I'm in a good mood, I'm not seeing things as they really are, especially with regard to Fitbits and other pleasures of disposable income. Given the choice between the two, I'd probably pick the health and self-delusion and the bright fantasies of the imagination over the alternative. But he goes even further than this. It's not just that we'd all rather on an individual level be in a state of health and imaginative expansion. It's that this delusion is actually better for the world around us, especially the very poorest who live in it. And here's where we finally get the invisible hand. Describing the paradox that he's just brought out, Smith further writes, and it is well that nature imposes upon us in this manner. It is this deception which rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. It is this which first prompted them to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths, and to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life. which have entirely changed the whole face of the globe, have turned the rude forests of nature into agreeable and fertile plains, and made the trackless and barren ocean a new fund of subsistence, and the great high road of communication to the different nations of the earth. The earth, by these labors of mankind, has been obliged to redouble her natural fertility and to maintain a greater multitude of inhabitants. It is to no purpose that the proud and unfeeling landlord views his extensive fields without a thought for the wants of his brethren. In imagination consumes himself the whole harvest that grows upon them. The homely and vulgar proverb that the eye is larger than the belly never was more fully verified than with regard to him. The capacity of his stomach bears no proportion to the immensity of his desires, and will receive no more than that of the meanest peasant. The rich only select from the heap of what is most precious and agreeable. They consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, though they mean only their own inconveniency, to the sole end which they propose from the labors of all the thousands whom they employ, be the gratification of their own vain and insatiable desires. They divide with the poor the produce of all of their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all of its inhabitants, and thus without intending it and without knowing it, advance the interests of the society and afford the multiplication of the species. Now, there's plenty to criticize about this, and Marx is going to come along a few years later and do it. But for now, I want to focus on what seems right about it. Smith's most interesting observation is that in an era where money can be made instead of merely inherited and spent, the activity of business and industry may improve the lives of the titans of industry quite a bit, but inadvertently, it improves the lives of everyone else more. The business leaders sacrifice real tranquility for their visions of wealth and grandeur. The end result is that we all get to buy books and toilet paper at a much lower price and have them delivered directly to our doors. Perhaps more substantively, they inadvertently encourage improvements in technology that tend to benefit us. Electric cars today, rides to space tomorrow. They don't mean to do it, and we may look at their fancy cars and phallic rockets and both envy them and roll our eyes, but in the end, are they really so much better off than all of us by orders of magnitude? Well, I, for one, would not want to be Elon Musk. The important takeaway from all of this is that Smith's formulation of the problem posits in some ways the same opposites that have favored cognitive dissonance about money since Plato. Smith at least sees it as a problem. We're all better off because some people are so rapacious and restless that they can't sit still and simply must figure out how to terraform Mars. On the other hand, most of us who are mentally balanced don't want to be such people. On the other hand, we at least partially see their point when we're in good, expansive moods, using our imaginations, our highest human capacities, to imagine looking out at the vista of our Martian estates and possibly working harder in our own small ways as a result, and likewise improving the lot of the species in some small way. But this is fundamentally self-delusion that taken to an extreme will harm us in the end. We end up in greater perplexity about how the ordinary business of life should look in our own lives. What's a human to do? Read Jane Austen. For Smith, as I've said, all of this remains on the level of an abstraction. He ends the section that poses this paradox shortly afterwards, having failed, in my opinion, to solve the problem when it comes to the individual moral question of how to exit this paradox. Perhaps the solution is implicit. Be the one who disdains the pursuit of wealth but benefits from it, although Smith shies away from saying so. Austen takes up the question in Sense and Sensibility, her first published novel, although the second one that she wrote. And she takes it up in remarkably Smithian terms, down to that Tweezer case I previously mentioned. Her solution to me seems to acknowledge more of the human reality of the pursuit of wealth, both its high moments and low moments, and what in the end all of this self-delusion might be for, not just for the species, but for the individual moral actor herself. I'm going to do a little bit to set up Sense and Sensibility for those of you who may not have read the book or remember the plot very well. In classic Austen fashion, it begins with the unfortunate intersection of economic conditions and social values. There's a family called Dashwood, and they are better off than most. Unfortunately, the reason they are better off than most is because of an estate entailed to the male line of the family, entail being the polite British term for disinheriting women. Mr. Dashwood has one son from a previous marriage, already well off from his mother's estate and from marrying above himself, and he has 3 daughters from his second marriage, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret. Mr. Dashwood, a prudent fellow, fully intends to put aside part of the income from the estate he has inherited every year to give his daughters a suitably attractive fortune each, one befitting their station as daughters of the gentry, and which will allow them to marry into their own class. Alas, Mr. Dashwood dies within a year of inheriting his estate, leaving his daughters and widow with very little to live on, let alone marry on. Although he implores on his deathbed the son from the prior marriage to provide for his half-sisters, we all know how such things go. The son is married to a conniving and greedy woman who, in one of the finest examples of comedic irony found in any novel, excuse me, that's my lights there, talks him down in the space of a few pages from his original intention of settling a very decent son on his father's other family to paying their moving costs when he forces them to relocate out of their childhood home to a cottage on the estate of a wealthy cousin. It's not all bad news. The 2 sisters who will concern us are Eleanor and Marianne, the 2 eldest. They are a study in contrasts and generally mapped onto the title of the novel. Eleanor is sense and Marianne sensibility, which in the 18th century meant something like openness to beauty, romance, and art, a kind of imaginative capacity, coupled with a keen feeling for other people. Austen sketches their characters briefly. Eleanor, quote, possessed a strength of understanding and a coolness of judgment, which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counselor of her mother, and enabled her frequently to counteract the advantage of them all, that eagerness of mind in Mrs. Dashwood, which must generally have led to imprudence. She had an excellent heart. Her disposition was affectionate and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. Eleanor quickly attracts the attention of a wealthy bachelor, Edward Faras, the brother-in-law to her selfish brother, a colorless and ambitionless fellow if there ever was one, but a decent sort all the same, and one who stands to be very rich someday. But before either of them can make a move, the conniving sister-in-law, who has, after all, been the source of Eleanor's impoverishment, works hard to separate them on the grounds that Eleanor is not our class darling. Marianne, age 16, is not so very different from her sister in many respects. She is sensible and clever, but also eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. Marianne and her mother seem to lack the switch that turns down our feelings. This, the narrator implies, is a bit more acceptable in a 16-year-old girl than in a 40-year-old widow. But still, Eleanor worries in particular about Marianne's capacity to feel so strongly, both for herself and for others. Eleanor worries a lot about a lot of things, in fact, and usually seems to be in a fairly anxious, fretful, particularly splenetic mood. And with that, you probably see where I'm beginning to go with this. Are Eleanor and Marianne the 2 different kinds of people that Smith discusses in the theory of moral sentiments? A conversation in the novel about money and the pursuit of wealth, and the way that the plot unfolds afterwards, suggests that they are perhaps in a way avatars for Smith's poor man's son at different points in time. Upon relocating to that cottage on the wealthy estate, or the wealthy cousin's estate, Marianne, much like the poor man's son, feels her material deprivation keenly. Perhaps not coincidentally then, she develops a budding romantic attachment to one John Willoughby, the nephew of a local grandee, who seems suddenly and equally attached to her. They are both passionate about each other and about the beauty and art and the fine and material comforts of the world, and seem at first blush like a very fine match. Marianne even has a backup, though, if needed, although he's less attractive in every single way. At the doddering age of 35, Colonel Brandon is less beautiful, less passionate, and less apparently wealthy than Willoughby, Brandon's estate amounting to a mere £2,000 a year. Incidentally, because people are always asking me about translating the sums in Austen's novels into modern dollars, Colonel Brandon is extremely well off by any standard with an income of £2,000 a year, circa 1797. It's just that he's more like someone who can afford to fly business class everywhere instead of getting around in his own private jet. As seasoned readers of Austen will realize, though, there's a catch to Willoughby, and part of it is not in Willoughby himself, although naturally he turns out to be quite the bad boy, this being an Austen novel. It's in Marianne's attitude towards him, and this attitude becomes partially illuminated in a conversation that occurs along strikingly Smithian lines early in the novel. Edward Faras, Eleanor's potential suitor, is constantly nudged by his overbearing mother and sister to make something of himself. Edward, however, is not a poor man's son visited with ambition, but a rich man's son who doesn't see any particular need to exert himself. In that sense, perhaps he is the happiest person in the novel on Smith's terms, although by the end we realize that this may not be the case for various reasons. He declares while visiting the Dashwoods in their new home that his only wish is to be happy, and, quote, greatness will not make it so. Marianne, upon hearing this, enters the conversation with a curious interjection and an apparent mishearing of Edward. What are wealth or grandeur to do with happiness, she asks, adding wealth to the list of things that she claims can't make one happy. Eleanor, ever sober-minded, surprises her sister by attacking this addition and replying, grandeur has but little, but wealth has much to do with it. Marianne castigates her sister. Beyond a competence, it can afford no real satisfaction as far as mere self is concerned. To which Eleanor replies that her sister's idea of a competence might closely match her own idea of extraordinary wealth. In the accustomed manner of all wicked older sisters, Eleanor manages to goad her sibling into an interesting admission that Marianne's idea of a bare competence, barely enough to live on, is about $2,000 a year. As we already mentioned in 1797, this is a sum that most of us would only dream of possessing, one which would put us in the very upper echelon of incomes in the United States in 2022. Marianne, though, the creature of imagination, quickly translates the sum into material goods and a prospect of her enjoyment of them, so that her sister will see the absolute necessity of securing this kind of income. $2,000 a year is a very moderate income, Marianne protests. A family can't be well maintained on smaller. I am sure I'm not extravagant in my demands. A proper establishment of servants, a carriage, perhaps two, and hunters cannot be supported on any less. Edward's incredulous interjection, hunters, but why must you have hunters, reveals that Eleanor's assumption is correct when, quote, she smiled again to hear her sister describing so accurately their future expenses at Combe Magna, which is the love interest Willoughby's very grand estate. Needless to say, Marianne is not coolly contemplating in a detached sort of way how much she will really need to live on. When her younger sister Margaret voices the thought that perhaps someone will endow them with a fortune, Marianne's eyes sparkle with animation. Her cheeks glow with, quote, the delight of such imaginary happiness. She is all of us in good spirits and excellent youthful health, bringing into sharp relief the specific ways that we will enjoy the funds we have not yet earned. That, after all, is how we begin to pursue economic activity. We see the things we want. We imagine ourselves enjoying them. And we feel, especially those of us who have read Smith, that Marianne is heading for a fall. But then the conversation takes another Smithian turn. Mrs. Dashwood remarks that she has no idea how she would spend a fortune, if not to give it away to her children, who presumably will already have a fortune. Eleanor, ever the wet blanket, tells her to invest it in improvements to the cottage. Quickly, her problem would go away. As a homeowner, I sympathize with this. It's Edward who makes the Smithian point. What magnificent orders would travel from this family to London in such an event? What a happy day for booksellers, music sellers, and print shops. As for Marianne, I know her greatness of soul. There would not be music enough in London to content her. And books. Thomson, Cooper, Scott. She would buy them all over and over again. She would buy up every copy, I believe, to prevent their falling into unworthy hands. And she would have every book that tells her how to admire an old twisted tree. And the bulk of her fortune would be laid out in annuities on the authors or their heirs. It's the old recognizable paradigm. Marianne will pursue a fortune, no endowments being forthcoming, based on her imaginative capacity to enjoy thinking about her position as mistress of a vast estate with a handsome husband, several small children, and a number of very fine steeds. In fact, Willoughby has already given her one, which unfortunately she has to reject because she has no stable for it. Like the collector of trinket boxes that Smith talked about in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, it's the kind of coveted good that only creates more trouble for the person who acquires it. That tweezer case requires a pocket to put it in, which requires a new overcoat, which requires a new set of brass buttons, which requires, you get the point. It's the Austen version of if you give a mouse a cookie. In case we missed the point, Austen later gives another character in the novel, Edward's repulsive younger brother, a very symbolically loaded quest for the perfect tweezer case. But Edward points to another aspect of all of this imaginative covetousness. Given a fortune, Marianne would enhance the world around her. After all, as Austen reminds us, she's a young woman of intelligence, sense, refinement, and taste. This is the desire and need that Smith told us vastly improves the world around us, cultivating the land, taming the ocean, and so on. Marianne might not mean any more than her selfish enjoyment of these things, but in enjoying them and aspiring to them, she would keep booksellers and musicians in business. Far from a pursuit of wealth that is diametrically opposed to the pursuit of wisdom, they are here intertwined, regardless of the intentions of the pursuer. It's only the ominous coda to the conversation that reminds us of the real cost of this pursuit, again in Smithian terms, in addition to the benefits. Eleanor and Edward try to decide between themselves whether Marianne is happy. She is not really merry, Eleanor concludes, despite Marianne's appearance of animation. It is as if Eleanor senses what is to come, which is a struggle on Marianne's part that puts the labors of Smith's poor man's son to shame. What she really sees is that all of Marianne's animation is directed towards future prospects, not current tranquility. Willoughby suddenly slips out of her grasp with little explanation. He takes advantage of the fact that he is a mobile young man with a carriage, and Marianne is a 16-year-old girl who can't go anywhere without a chaperone, to flee to London. Through various contrivances in the acquisition of a chaperone, although alas, one that she hates and must pay court to anyway, again, echoes of the poor man's son paying court to all the world, Marianne gets herself to London, where she wears herself out every night writing letters to Willoughby that he never answers. Her reward for all of this labor, and she is at her desk promptly as any overworked London clerk, as Eleanor observes, is to see Willoughby at a ball, dancing with the heiress whom he will later marry for her money. In an instant, all of Marianne's hopes, all of those imaginative wanderings through the halls of Combe Magna are dashed. On the way home to her cottage, she, like the poor man's son, falls desperately ill and sees Willoughby for what he really is, a rake, a cheat, someone who spends beyond his income, thus necessitating the rich wife, and on the whole, not worth all of the trouble that she's putting into getting him. It sees the man version of a tweezer case. Even if she had got him, the novel's final chapter suggests none of these problems would have gone away for her. He's an imprudent man and a lover of toys without Marianne's high moral character to recommend him. In the final insult, we learn that his aunt, the aptly named Mrs. Smith, would have been happy to give him her fortune if he hadn't behaved so badly. Like a tweezer case, he is something that Marianne thought would bring her more ease, but actually just brings her more problems. But Marianne's economic journey has been equally circular and equally extraordinary. For at the end of the novel, she marries Colonel Brandon, the besotted older gentleman of the advanced age of 35, whose estate happens to be worth $2,000 a year, Marianne's bare competency for happiness. In other words, she has sacrificed the real tranquility that was in her power at the beginning of the novel for absolutely nothing more than what she might have had around page 75. Furthermore, Colonel Brandon being of a rather more sterling moral character than his younger rival, she might have potentially had more had she quit at that point. But before we end here in the unsatisfying conclusion that Austen simply reproduces Smith's paradox in the Dashwood sisters, one prudent and disinclined to pursue wealth, and the other a flighty malcontent who wants more than she should, we need to go back to the beginning, to the description of Eleanor and Marianne that I pointed out does little distinguish them, apart from their attitude towards prudence. Although critics have often fallen into the trap of reading the novel this way, it is not a full-fledged and hearty endorsement of Eleanor's prudence over Marianne's imagination. It's Edward's comment about the booksellers and the general improvement of the world that first clues us into this. The fact is that Eleanor and her very appropriately matched suitor Edward are not movers and shakers, even if they are rather tranquil on Smithian terms. In fact, if the plot of the novel was their love story, there would be very little plot at all. They meet, sort of maybe fall in love, and then more or less avoid each other for most of the middle 75% of the book. They're too boring to watch. Marianne and Willoughby's drama is interesting to watch, much as Marianne herself, as Austen reminded us in the beginning, is interesting. Indeed, I would argue that despite the precedence she takes in the novel's title, there is no argument for Eleanor as the main character, even if we regard the main character of the novel as the one who changes the most. Austen tells us as much. Marianne Dashwood, she says, was born to an extraordinary fate. She was born to discover the falsehood of her own opinions and counteract by her conduct her most favorite maxims. She found herself at 19 submitting to new attachments, entering on new duties, placed in a new home, a wife, the mistress of the family, and patroness of the village. Eleanor, on the other hand, does manage to scrape together enough to marry Edward, but her marriage divided her as little from her family as could well be contrived, which is a polite way of saying that nothing much changes in her life from beginning to end. And unlike Marianne, she never ends up the patroness of anything, spreading largesse to a village. I believe it is Austen's suggestion that Eleanor's quiet lack of imagination, her tranquility, might not in the end be synonymous with happiness to the extent that happiness entails some kind of richness or greatness of vision. Indeed, it is Marianne's early sensibility and openness to the pleasures and sensations of the world, the glowing cheek of imagination, even self-delusion, that, once she's undergone her own economic journey, makes her in some ways the most successful character in the novel. Sobered up, but with the memory of her covetousness and the real burdens it imposed, she finds she can love Colonel Brandon, be happy with her bare competence of $2,000 a year, and serve others with joy. But the journey part, with all of its labors and illnesses, was essential, and 2,000 is no mere competence. Simply having the right Eleanorish disdain for money and the things that it might buy at the beginning of the book would not only have stopped the booksellers and music sellers in London from prospering, but in some sense would have failed to generate the delightful novel that is Sense and Sensibility. Austen closes the book in this way. Between Barton and Delaford, which are the houses where Eleanor and Marianne live, there was that constant communication which strong family affection would naturally dictate. Sense and Sensibility communicate with each other, and one, Austen suggests, is fairly useless without the other, especially when it comes to the estates, equipages, and pleasures of this world. Her solution to Smith's problem may be that tranquility and contentment with regards to money are not the same thing as happiness, and that there is indeed an individual balance to be struck that preserves both the good qualities of striving, its energy and ambition in the way it opens one up to beauty, and the wisdom that eventually, but only eventually, rests in tranquility. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Chamberlain. That was excellent. I think you opened up a context for Jane Austen and Adam Smith that most of us have not considered before. And so thank you for enlarging our context on that. Everyone feel free to ask questions. I'll start with a question. It seems to me like the Industrial Revolution is a kind of revolution that keeps on giving. It kind of produces an insatiability that bears within itself kind of death and rebirth that can never satisfy. And it seems like today in our attention economy that what we seek for, perhaps even more than wealth, is, and maybe this tracks a little bit with Edward, but we seek to be known, we seek to be heard and listened to. Maybe not even greatness so much, but we seek to be a voice kind of out there. Do you think that tracks a little bit with the striving of the Dashwoods in some way? Or even just that whole time period?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I wonder though whether Austen or Smith would recognize that need for attention. It seems like that might actually be one of the problems with Marianne, is that she's looking for more recognition than as a second daughter of a poor widowed mother that she can seem to get. And I would think that part of her journey is the realization that she can do good without being this great romantic voice for attention to, what is it, Edward said, twisted trees and things like that. That her sort of love of ensuring or of seeing and ensuring beauty in the world can be turned out towards other people. I don't know quite what the implication is for us now for that, but it seems like that is the journey that Marianne undergoes.
But isn't that one of Adam Smith's chief virtues, is to kind of like increase the well-being of others?
Yeah, and this is something as we were kind of discussing before, that posed for these German critics in the 19th century, this Adam Smith problem, that there was some sort of disconnect between the wealth of nations and its famous assertion that it's not through the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, et cetera, that we get our meal, but by appealing to their self-interest. And then people go back and look at the theory of moral sentiments, and the basic idea of the theory of moral sentiments is that above all, what we really seek from other people is sympathy. We seek this, this desire for them to sympathize with us, that we gain by sympathizing with them, and that this is the foundation of a sort of moral community, is deciding where these standards of sympathy lie. And a lot of people will say, well, what does that have to do with self-interest? And Smith would say, I think that kind of self-interest is a it's a desire that we have that has a weird kind of selfish quality at the same time that it is a reaching out to other people, a seeking of their approval.
And it's rooted in the imagination, right? The ability for a person to imagine themselves in the shoes of another.
Yeah, I didn't have time to really talk about this in the lecture, but that whole part about sympathy, or about the rich and imagining ourselves rich, it's kind of almost a defect of sympathy. Smith says that we're much more able to sympathize with the rich because we like imagining ourselves and in their minds looking out at everything that they have. Sympathy for the poor is harder for that reason, because it's harder to want to place yourself in the shoes of the poor. Nevertheless, it's the very fact that we sympathize for the rich more that ends up benefiting the poor in the end.
Oh.
It's a fun paradox.
That's a paradox.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like in some weird way the Industrial Revolution unleashed imagination into the world. But the sad thing is that it at the same time it produces this kind of hunger for novelty that is always never kind of fixes itself into one thing. And so it may be, like you say, it may lead to the birth of Amazon or to Tesla, but at the same time, when you wrap yourself into the logic of novelty, you bless people, but at the same time, that double-sided kind of paradox, you could live a life of unhappiness. That's the paradox, I guess, right?
Yeah, and I think, again, that the Austen is just pointing to that in what it might look like in one individual life. And fortunately, it's a rather hopeful vision, I think. And maybe one that just has to do with the wisdom that comes with age, although there are a lot of snarky comments in the book about how Marianne, at the age of 16, lived, such a long time to overcome her all of those delusions that she held so firmly at that age, which also feels like a kind of psychologically apt thing for Austen to say, that at 16, Marianne thinks that she knows everything that she has to know about the world, and she's already formed all of her opinions, and these are her opinions, and she's not going to change them. And she is the character who, undergoes this very profound change throughout the novel.
So we have a comment and then a question. Betsy Vandenberg says, just want to say thanks for such a fascinating peek into Austen via Adam Smith, pop culture and other delightful anecdotes. I've never read Austen this way and would love to finish the last part via a recording. She had to step out. Thank you so much, Dr. Shannon, for sharing your literary insight, humor, and wisdom with us at Books and Bridges.
Thank you.
And then Randy Paul, I believe, has a question. Let's see if he hasn't typed it out, but he is raising his hand. Randy, go ahead and type your question in. We'll just wait for that. You know, another paradox that comes to mind is the ambition of an artist, or the ambition of a literary creator, and how they really are striving for greatness. They're competing against the greats. You know, if you buy into Professor Bloom's, oh gee, what's his first name? Not Alan, but the other Bloom, Harold. Yeah, if you buy into Harold Bloom's theory about the anxiety of influence, I mean, these great artists, they are competing. I think it was Hemingway that said he's in the boxing ring with Tolstoy, and he's aiming for victory. I mean, and in many ways, the artist lives a tortured life, but yet the beauty that they produce for everyone else is kind of what you're talking about, I think.
Yeah. Again, when you're young, you have these romantic delusions about what it's like to be an artist, and you think it's, you know, sitting at your desk, maybe taking inspiration from the muse. But the artists I know are probably the most ambitious and hardworking people that I can picture.
And I think the same applies for academics. You bring into our lives such mind expanding, you know, truths, but yet, you know, the life of an academic, that's a life of striving, and that's a life of, you know, competitive, intellectual, you know.
Yeah.
That
got one of those delusions, and that I was stripped of at not at 16, but while I was in graduate school. I thought it was going to be an easier life than it was.
Mm-hmm. And you became your disillusionment. You overcame your disillusionment.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, when I was rereading this again, Sense and Sensibility, and Marianne at her labors, and you know, writing all those useless letters to Willoughby, I was thinking about an issue that, you know, is important for me. I have a 3-year-old daughter, and I feel like I do not spend. I feel like I'm either failing her or failing my job most of the time, and you know, so that seems like another, you know, another thing to think about, you know, in terms of wealth. Is there, you know, I think I asked this question at the beginning, I never solved it, but is there a balance between, say, you know, striving for a certain amount of material comfort and still having a family life? That may be one of these things about the current era that gets harder and harder.
Yeah, wow. And I think, you know, we also live in this age of vulnerability, in which it's more acceptable to share the kinds of things that you just shared. And I think that does produce into the world some of the sympathy that Adam Smith talked about, when we hear the other side of the success, the costs, you know, of the success. So thanks for sharing that.
Helps us make better choices. I don't know. I hope that it does.
Yeah.
And I think Adam Smith is really big about sort of bringing things to the imagination and bringing things to light. And I think that Jane Austen really takes him up on that. I'm going to see what this actually looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Christy asks, how does Austen's character Lady Susan inform your points?
Oh Lord. I gotta confess that it's been a long time since I read Lady Susan. I saw the Love and Friendship adaptation a few years ago. But you know, I think one of the interesting things about Lady Susan is that she's one of the few characters of the nobility. The nobility tends not to fare too well in an Austen novel. And I think that this became more and more clear towards the end of her life, especially with Persuasion. It's the noble characters who seem to have the worst, the worst sort of relationship to money. I think because it's a static one and it isn't one that, you know, you're thinking about in terms of any of the benefits of searching for it or pursuing it. And if memory serves, Lady Susan falls into that category. But I always like to think about Sir Walter Elliot in Persuasion when it comes to something like this. He's arguably one of the worst characters in Austen, and he you know, he has all of the snobbishness of a man who has money, but he actually has none. So he has none of the virtues that might go with the getting of money, but all the things that that are entailed in having it, all the bad things about having it. And he's of course contrasted to the enterprising sailors of the Navy in Persuasion, who are also pursuers of fortune. But yeah, Christy, let's talk more about that at some point when I've had a chance to look at Lady Susan again.
That could also apply to I forget his name, but the noble in Mansfield Park. He,
Sir
although,
Thomas?
yeah, I think so. He does kind of undermine the whole endeavor of the novel and the imagination, romance. So it's a different aspect of that, but quite a bit different than Eliot.
Yeah.
So we have a question from Randy Paul. He asks, what would Austen make of the radical choices available with respect to religious change, gender change, optional marriage, work, and the catch-all lifestyle today?
It's always hard to know what people would make of people from an earlier time would make of our modern era. I think Jane Austen would very much like the fact that women can, at least to some extent, pursue their own fortunes now. I think she would almost write different books. I think that she's very interested in this question of whether it's possible to be a little bit mercenary and a little bit good at the same time. And I think that, I mean, a lot of the things on your list there, I think she and anybody else from an earlier would just find bewildering. But I think that she would have a lot of fun writing women today. That's.
I mean, she definitely did. Even though I think her art aspires to, and I think in some ways reaches universality, but she's very much writing in a narrow culture. I even read someplace about the unbearable whiteness of Jane Austen. You know, she lives in her time period, and she has her worldview and her. But yeah, she does attain unto a kind of universality, and I think in what she writes.
Yeah, I think she would find racial categories today particularly hard to understand. A lot of those racial categories that people talk about now weren't really invented until the 18th and 19th century. As categories. So I think that she would. I don't think that she would have described herself as white, for instance.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's just beyond her viewpoint.
You know, there are a lot of people who attempt to adapt, of course, Austen into modern forms. You know, millions of them. Clueless and 10 Things I Hate About You. And then there was a series a couple of years back where they commissioned, I think it was Random House commissioned famous authors to write Austen adaptations in the modern era. And it was interesting the ways that they had to struggle to make sense of combining the quest for love and money that is so common in Austen, because for most modern women, these are two separate things. And so I think that, you know, as I was thinking about what I just said a few minutes ago, I think that she would find writing modern women interesting, but I think that her novels would end up looking very different from how they actually look now.
Natasha asks a question. Thanks for a very insightful lecture. There seems to be a movement towards having less material and more tranquil wealth. Do you think this might undermine the existing economy in the long run? If we stop buying, will the world economy crash?
Well, I'm not an economist, but I think that there is something in the idea that there's an imaginative capacity that we have to think about ourselves enjoying things, and that imaginative capacity is at the root of a lot of the decisions that we make, a lot of the trade-offs that we make that I talked about earlier. And I would say that I think that imaginative capacity is human and universal and is unlikely to go away. So I'm not too worried about the world economy, but I think that there is something in the reservations that both Smith and Austen express about what that might look like in any individual life. And I think ultimately what they're asking us to do is to be thoughtful about it. I don't think that they're saying that we should be indolent, and I don't think that they're saying that we should pursue money at all costs, but that we should understand what we're giving up in each case. And you know, there are costs and benefits in both ways, and I think that ultimately is what makes them classic economic thinkers, is that they think about things in terms of cost benefit like that.
Yeah, I think you don't really see a heavy pedantic moralizing from Jane Austen. I don't think about this. She's very non-direct in a lot of the lessons that she puts forward.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
so, yeah, go ahead.
She has a light hand.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about just trying to play out these scenarios in individual lives that makes and in one way, the specifics of it can make you think, oh, well, I mean, how well does this apply to me? But on the other hand, there's something about the specifics that bring it to life and that make you apply it to your own life. So it's the neatest trick the novel ever performed, I think.
Yeah. Adam Smith did need a novelist to kind of extend or in flesh his ideas. So we have a question.
A lot of stories, but he tells a lot of stories, but yeah, they're not extended stories. And I think that he does have a lot of interest in storytelling. And before he was ever a moral philosopher, he was a lecturer on rhetoric. So he has a lot of interest in that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's true. So we have a question from one of the attendees. You talk about how it's easier to sympathize or maybe just visualize what life might be like as a well-off person, but at the same time mention how off-putting the Musks of the world can be. Is there a disconnect there?
Yeah, I think what we do is that we imagine that we would be Elon Musk without any of the Elon Muskness of Elon Musk. We imagine ourselves, you know, enjoying the things that Elon Musk has, but retaining our own individual character without thinking about the fact that Elon Musk has gotten where he is, either because he had that character in the first place, or because he cultivated that character deliberately through the things that he did. And it's probably a little bit of both. Obviously, that tends to be how moral character works. But yeah, I think that's the trick we perform, is that we imagine that I would be Shannon Chamberlain, but I would have a fancier house and a nicer car or something like that.
Yeah. By the way, how do you spell the German word for that Elon Musk problem?
Oh, das Adam Smith problem. I think problem is just the English spelling.
Yeah, that's funny. But actually, Natasha makes another comment. She says, as a side note, I try to never miss the free public lectures at St. John's in Annapolis. It is truly a sanctuary of the mind. Right on, Natasha. Did you ever teach or visit Annapolis campus?
Sadly, no. And my travel is somewhat confined these days, but soon, maybe someday. Santa Fe's pretty beautiful though, so I'll put in a plug for us as well.
And Elisa Waite asks the question, I think it's interesting how often we read Eleanor as Austen's hero in the novel, not acknowledging Marianne's growth, as you point out. It reminds me of the Mary Martha false dichotomy that we often read into the New Testament. I feel like we often see Marianne as humbled and submissive immediately following her ordeal, rather than how you present her. How much do you think the social perception of propriety of women's roles at the time and now play into our reading of these characters, dismissing Austen's more complex message?
Yeah, so Austen had some comments in her own letters and things like that about this very problem that everybody seemed to read Eleanor as the heroine of Sense and Sensibility, and she never directly says why she thinks it's a wrong reading, but she does say that it is a wrong reading. And so I think that one nice thing about Eleanor is that she doesn't go through the kind of turbulence that Marianne does. She kind of stays the same. She's kind of the person that we all imagine that we would want to be, because we don't like to imagine ourselves in trouble. We don't like to imagine ourselves going through what Marianne goes through. We don't like to imagine ourselves crossed in love or anything like that. But this seems to me somehow akin to the advice that writers often get, which is torture your darlings. We have a, beginning writers especially have a tendency to, make their main characters into Mary Janes or something like that, and who are perfect in every way, and that makes for a really boring book. And I would say it's probably the inadequacy of Eleanor that led. I often wonder if maybe the novel just started off that way, as the story of Eleanor, and then Austen, being a great writer, figured, oh wait, this is too boring. I've got to add Marianne in here. It's not going to work.
Oh, that's funny. Okay. I'll go back to Edward for a second and just bring up what his mother and sister, kind of the plan they had for him, which was to quote, be someone, right? That's what he said, to be someone. Mm-hmm. And wow, that really does plague us in today's world, being someone, and just the quest for meaning. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't even have to be about status always, but finding meaning, but usually that meaning is kind of situated in some kind of social context in which we find belonging, in which our contribution to the world has an impact. We have an impact crisis, a meaning crisis. And I think reading this novel and reading Adam Smith could definitely inform that. It's a little bit different, but I think the guts of that idea are, I think, addressed in these two works.
Yeah, I think, I mean, all of Austen's novels are in some sense about finding that meaning. And what emerges for me in the Enlightenment in the 18th century is the fact that the old religious stabilities, the things that used to give people a real sense of purpose and meaning and kind of an arc to their lives, are more seriously called into question. And I see Austen and Smith as maybe beginning a very modern project of trying to find meaning without necessarily resorting to religion, trying to impose an arc of meaning on our own lives, a sort of storytelling about what it is that we're up to, and what the meaning of all of our struggles has been.
Yeah, well, that takes my mind to a thinker named is Alan Taylor. Oh my gosh, The Secular Age. No, it's not Alan Taylor, but he wrote The Secular Age, and it's largely about how we have more options for our own spiritual kind of vistas in the secular age than the pre-secular person had. And so we're kind of left with this struggle to kind of make our own meaning. And that's, talk about angst and anxiety right there.
Well, yeah, those trinkets, we invest a lot in deciding between Fitbits and things like that. And maybe that's our way of coping with the fact that we don't have that sense of meaning anymore, that maybe that's a trying to gesture towards it, a pursuit of something that ends up not to be what the thing that we really end up with in the end.
Randy reminds us that it's Charles Taylor, not Alan Taylor.
Oh, okay.
So this will be the last question from Natasha. In Camus' view, search for meaning is a weakness of mind. He urges to embrace the absurdity of life and of us in his myth of Sisyphus, and abandon the pursuit of meanings and explanations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm reminded of in that is a line from Pride and Prejudice, was one of my favorites, where Mr. Bennet says, "For what do we live but to make sport for our neighbors and to laugh at them in our turn?" So maybe there's a little bit of the existential in Jane Austen as well.
That sounds like almost something that Nietzsche could say. Well, I think we should end there. This has been a fascinating, delve and dive into the world of Jane Austen, the world of a world that's trying to come to terms with the Industrial Revolution, and what that does to social connections, ties, class expectations, and mobility. So yeah, this has been very thought-provoking. I really appreciate you, Dr. Chamberlain, coming. Any last word?
Go laugh at your neighbors.
Yeah.
And expect to be laughed at in your turn.
That's right. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you
very
for
much.
inviting me, and thanks for all of your questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. We'll see you next time.